In 1943, the Atlantic convoys transported more than just armaments, petroleum, and provisions. They also ferried troops seized from the combat zones of North Africa and Europe. Thousands of German troops were aboard, toughened by battles in Tunisia, Sicily, and Italy. As they set foot on U.S. territory, these captives braced for severe handling, picturing iron's animosity and grueling toil. Yet, reality shattered the preconceptions fed by their propaganda. The U.S. military enforced strict order, but adhered to Geneva Convention standards, delivering one of the most surprising encounters imaginable: the chance to tour nearby settlements under supervision, yet free of restraints. This unassuming freedom, no fetters, imprinted itself deeply, surfacing often in post-war diaries and accounts. The astonishment hit right away, the moment these men alighted from rail cars that shuttled them from eastern harbors to vast facilities deep in America's interior. Scattered across places like Texas, Oklahoma, Nebraska, and Iowa, these sites accommodated tens of thousands of German detainees. Far from basic enclosures, they operated as self-contained societies. Right from the start, the overseers, often youthful U.S. troops, struck a tone of command tempered with respect. During outings for labor duties or guided excursions, no rattle of shackles echoed. Rather, the groups proceeded in neat formations, monitored yet unbound, a jarring shift for those drilled in the Wehrmacht's rigid discipline and the merciless handling of prisoners back in Europe. The freedom from bonds proved bewildering. The communities that hosted these supervised parties were usually countryside outposts grappling with worker deficits. With countless American males deployed abroad in uniform, agriculture and local enterprises labored to meet needs. Regional leaders, partnering with the Defense Ministry, consented to hiring German POWs. Oversight demanded armed escorts. Still, the difference stood out sharply. A few rifle-bearing troops might supervise scores of Germans moving at will amid silos, croplands, or even down a village's central avenue. Narratives capture instances where detainees paused to peer at store displays, hear radio tunes spilling from eateries, or inhale the aroma of newly brewed Java from a coffee house. For fighters who had clashed with this country mere months before, it felt otherworldly. Among the sharpest memories were those from captives observing that U.S. residents refrained from jeering or hurling abuse. Many locals regarded them with cautious interest. Kids occasionally gestured, spotting the unfamiliar attire. Desperate ranchers, grateful for aid, offered straightforward nods of appreciation. These locales remained untouched by aerial assaults, in contrast to Germany's devastated urban centers. Roads stayed whole, shops brimmed with merchandise, and daily existence hummed with a wealth inconceivable amid Europe's devastation. To the German fighters, it offered a peek at a realm propaganda claimed was a myth, one of plenty, liberty, and structure enduring the worldwide strife. The restraint-free policy held deep symbolism. It implied faith while signaling assurance. The U.S. military's belief in its framework of control was robust enough to forego parading enemies in irons. Officials grasped that order and spirit could persist sans degrading those held. This method clashed vividly with the captives' notions of how the Nazi regime managed its prisoners. Propaganda painted Americans as savage threats. But every stroll along serene lanes chipped away at that myth. By late 1943, countless German POWs had joined these supervised outings. Homeward correspondents, screened yet telling, described the odd taste of liberty amid confinement. A one-time trooper later reflected that going unchained evoked being seen as human, not beast. That nuance, understated but potent, formed the core of enduring impressions for numerous survivors well beyond the conflict's close. Upon reaching America, German captives' odysseys typically started long prior, in seized North African bastions or Italian harbors. After the Africa Corps surrendered in May 1943, around 150,000 Axis personnel came under Allied control. To avoid burdening strained British sites, tens of thousands crossed the ocean. The crossings proved arduous and perilous, with U-boats lurking on sea routes, yet the Allies viewed distant U.S. internment as preferable to proximity to European fronts. Midway through the war, America detained close to 400,000 Germans. German POWs were dispersed to camps spanning over 40 states. When they reached East Coast facilities like Camp Shanks in New York or Fort Dix in New Jersey, the troops faced thorough protocols. Fingerprints were taken. They received standard outfits emblazoned with PW in bold black lettering, and medical checks were conducted. The 1929 Geneva Convention specified protections for captives, which the U.S. Armed Forces adhered to rigorously, eager to showcase their adherence. Meals matched the portions for U.S. soldiers, and essentials like soap, towels, and bedding were provided. For troops expecting harsh cruelty, such handling proved surprisingly lenient. Once processed, the detainees climbed aboard lengthy trains heading westward. Sites in Texas, including Camp Hearn and Camp Swift, turned into key centers. Nebraska's Camp Atlanta and Iowa's Fort Alona quickly accommodated thousands additionally. These installations functioned like miniature communities, typically enclosed by fences but not overly secured. Barracks made of wood dotted the landscape, alongside mess halls, cafeterias, and chapels. Detainees soon discovered that order was upheld via routines and supervision instead of bodily harm. U.S. officers emphasized that compliance with regulations would ensure a measure of respect. It was in this initial establishment period that arrangements for supervised outings to nearby towns took shape. The War Department's Office of the Provost Marshal General collaborated with regional farm associations and city officials. An official agreement framework was introduced, allowing localities to apply for POW assistance via proper procedures. The authorities compensated the prisoners with a small allowance and canteen vouchers, while the farmers or businesses remitted funds to the federal government. Guards shadowed these teams from the start, though the image of German troops moving freely without restraints grew more routine. The intake process also featured informational sessions. Detainees learned that escape efforts would face penalties, yet positive conduct could unlock benefits like library materials, learning programs, and for numerous individuals, chances to labor beyond the perimeter. Those with particular expertise, mechanics, woodworkers, or chefs, frequently took on roles inside the compounds, whereas general workers formed the core of farming assignments. To the Germans, the prospect of venturing into adjacent areas, albeit monitored, felt remarkable. The idea of strolling unrestrained through an enemy nation amid conflict appeared inconceivable. Nevertheless, the U.S. military designed the framework deliberately to sustain spirits and efficiency. Another element of intake involved collecting intelligence. Locations like Fort Hunt in Virginia, dubbed P.O. Box 1142, questioned chosen detainees for insights into German armaments and troop sentiments. Even in those covert operations, handling stayed compliant with the law. Most POWs, after vetting, were directed to standard sites where daily existence settled into a pattern. Early morning wake-ups, head counts, dining, and then conveyance to job sites, shifting from battlefield combatant to confined inhabitant, induced an odd mental adjustment. Numerous Germans were still grappling with the dismay of losses in Africa or Sicily. Rather than confronting barbed wire aggression, they met an organized yet strangely compassionate setup. As the initial labor groups formed, with vehicles ferrying them to local areas, the soldiers started grasping that imprisonment in America would diverge sharply from their expectations. The lack of restraints on these outings represented not just U.S. assurance, but also recognition that authority could rely on discipline and collaboration over unrelenting coercion. For countless German troops, their initial step outside the enclosures proved indelible. It wasn't a chained procession or intense surveillance as they had foreseen, but a stroll down serene U.S. avenues overseen by merely a few armed attendants. These preliminary interactions with American locales exposed a reality far removed from Nazi media depictions. Troops had been conditioned to view the United States as a realm of disorder, lawlessness, and ethnic strife. Instead, they witnessed tidy walkways, thriving stores, and residents who appeared intrigued rather than aggressive. In places like Iowa, Minnesota, and Kansas, POWs were guided through settlements seemingly spared from the European conflict. German captives observed no structure showing bomb damage, no span collapsed in wreckage. Midwestern America in the 1940s conveyed steadiness. Eateries brimmed with folks enjoying coffee, cinemas promoted fresh Hollywood films, and markets overflowed with items that felt like distant dreams in their homeland. Even with rationing still in effect, the plenty on display left the captives amazed. Items like butter, fresh cuts of meat, tinned fruits, and packs of cigarettes appeared in volumes unseen since the conflict's outset. Certain overseers permitted the detainees short pauses near storefronts or to glance at pasted-up ads on buildings, offering brief peeks into everyday existence in an affluent nation. Local residents' responses differed widely. Numerous viewed the Germans warily, haunted by memories of Pearl Harbor, lurid headlines about war crimes, and the fierce clashes where U.S. fathers and siblings battled precisely these soldiers. However, some approached the encounters with routine pragmatism. Ranchers recognized these workers' value for the autumn yield. Regional enterprises understood that the Defense Department supplied POW manpower to sustain output levels. Youngsters, driven by innate wonder, occasionally greeted them with waves or attempted chats with the outsiders. To the Germans, the lack of aggression or animosity was staggering. Rather, the vibe carried a measured politeness, a jarring shift from the savage U.S. image peddled by Goebbels' propaganda. Personal testimonies capture the nuanced aspects of these initial interactions. Detainees noted the lined-up automobiles along roadways, Fords, Chevrolets, and Studebakers, operating reliably even amid wartime manufacturing pivots. Some remembered tunes wafting from unshuttered panes, featuring artists such as Bing Crosby or the Glenn Miller Orchestra, melodies linking them to a realm distant from regimental anthems. In a particular memoir, an ex-detainee expressed his disbelief at witnessing pairs wandering arm in arm, oblivious to bombing alerts or blackout rules. For him, the evident lack of dread highlighted the sharpest divide from home, where ordinary routines lingered under perpetual war shadows. The escorts trailing these parties functioned more as tour leaders than strict wardens. Firearms were toted, yet the composure and decorum were notable. A handful of watchers for multitudes of inmates, relying on orderliness in the expansive terrain to deter bolting. The Germans quickly grasped their slim odds of vanishing into endless tracts of unknown terrain, making the arrangement effective. This faith, or strategic poise, prompted later musings on the U.S. method. For residents, beholding Axis attire parading unchained through familiar districts proved arresting. Occasional press commentaries raised alarms, questioning the leniency granted to foes. Yet authorities calmed worries by affirming safeguards remained firm. Gradually, such outings normalized, although the wonder lingered for participants. That initial tread on U.S. pavement, unbound but captive, embodied the odd duality of internment here, restricted, yet afforded tastes of freedom grander than under their prior regime. As hostilities persisted and U.S. fields and plants grappled with severe staffing deficits, Axis POWs integrated vital into the home front labor pool. From autumn 1943 onward and across 1944, the War Manpower Commission greenlit broad deployment of POW efforts in numerous regions. What stunned the Germans wasn't just the scale of duties allotted, but the liberty allowed in navigating U.S. locales to fulfill them. Their contributions stretched well past basic facility upkeep. They proved indispensable to wartime farming and manufacturing yields. Farming claimed most of the German effort. In areas such as Texas, Colorado, and Nebraska, POWs trucked or hiked each day to plots of cotton, corn, sugar beets, and wheat. Gathering periods might have faltered absent them, with natives abroad in service and machines insufficient for needs. Ex-GI farmers noted the soldiers toiled extended shifts, typically overseen by a mere pair of rifle-bearing watchers, sans bindings. They harvested yields, operated machinery, or mended barriers with focus, possibly spurred by improved meals or appreciation for purposeful tasks beyond barracks. For the detainees, this represented an unusual confinement, permitting unfettered grip on agrarian implements and strides over broad expanses, all beneath the vigilant yet oddly lax gaze of attendants. Factory roles surfaced too. Certain areas loaned POWs to timber operations, food processing plants, and modest workshops crafting civilian items. Though the Geneva Convention barred direct involvement in weapons, their support bolstered efforts indirectly. Take Wisconsin, where German holds aided pulp facilities, or Michigan, dispatching them to isolated timber cuts. Once more, the restraint-free setup baffled them. Sawmills tools like shovels, axes, and large equipment were handed over to them. Nevertheless, the Americans believed that discipline would hold steady. Attempts to flee were uncommon, in part because captives realized the pointlessness of crossing expansive countryside areas, but also due to the framework fostering a shared sense of reliability. Monetary setups further supported this unusual balance. Captives weren't paid salaries outright, but they earned modest credits for camp store purchases, allowing them to buy essentials like hygiene items, stationery, or minor indulgences such as smokes and sweets. Local growers and builders compensated the U.S. authorities at a set daily fee per laborer, establishing a structured and controlled arrangement. German POWs frequently noted that their handling was better than anticipated and even superior to the coerced work conditions they recalled from Europe. These job assignments turned into some of the standout experiences of their detention. Personal accounts highlight the captives' wonder at the boundless farmlands of the Midwest, or their involvement in reaping seasons that overshadowed anything from their homeland. For those raised on modest homesteads, the automated vastness of U.S. farming felt daunting yet awe-inspiring. One detainee later expressed his astonishment at the dimensions of a lone harvester, describing it as a device as big as a dwelling. The contributions of these German laborers left a deep mark on the surrounding areas, too. Numerous ranchers later admitted that absent these workers, their yields would have been completely forfeited amid the conflict. Local papers now and then covered the output of these crews, pointing out the peculiarity that opposing troops were aiding in nourishing the nation. Yet, for the captives, the deeper contradiction was in how they were managed. Foes of the nation still granted mobility and access to important implements. This oddity helped shape their view of America as a pragmatic and assured society, depending on streamlined operations over harsh control to uphold stability. Outside of farm duties and labor shifts, routine existence for the German detainees unveiled facets of U.S. society they hadn't imagined encountering in confinement. As supervised teams ventured from bases for tasks or outings, they naturally picked up elements of regional customs, amusements, and routines. Gradually, this immersion in culture proved as impactful as the physical liberties, altering their outlook on the nation and its inhabitants. Tunes held a notably vivid place. The 1940s U.S. mainstream scene revolved around swing and jazz, with those melodies seeping into enclosures via broadcasts or town trips. Figures like Glenn Miller's band, Benny Goodman, and Duke Ellington were household names for locals, but novel to Germans used to martial anthems or government-sanctioned traditional songs. Plenty of POWs found themselves captivated by these beats while strolling by eateries or spotting coin-operated music players in rural cafes. The notion that such vibrant, free-form sounds formed everyday backdrops stood in stark opposition to the stiff ideological environment of the Third Reich. Athletics offered yet another glimpse. In places such as Iowa and Texas, detainees noticed signs for baseball contests, and occasionally camps hosted games with provided gear. Overseers sometimes set up casual contests pitting U.S. personnel against German captives, as recorded in base bulletins. To the Germans, the game initially appeared strange with its odd guidelines and jargon, yet it represented recreation during wartime. Watching locals' fervor for a pastime devoid of strategic value highlighted for the prisoners the richness of their overseers' heritage. Learning chances also factored into this cultural interplay. Numerous sites provided English lessons using materials from the YMCA or nearby institutions. When groups were chaperoned to reading rooms or allowed book deliveries, they delved into works from U.S. past to modern fiction. Several German leaders urged their subordinates to engage with these materials, aiming to sustain order via education. A few detainees came back post-war with proficient English, acquired in detention. This mental liberty, combined with guided entry to study spaces and archives, highlighted the difference from the oppressive limits they had endured before. Faith practices received due regard as well. Clergy from Catholic and Protestant groups in adjacent towns could enter sites, and at times detainees under watch joined town worship sessions. This unforeseen aspect of cultural contact practicing faith freely in congregations with ordinary folk, struck many Germans who had seen governmental meddling in religion under Nazism. Everyday encounters with residents, despite their constraints, these encounters left enduring marks on the prisoners. As they marched through local communities, local people occasionally drew near, trying halting dialogues or handing over modest gifts such as fruit or reading materials. Occasionally, merchants quietly provided items to the POWs despite their escorts, though many locals kept a wary separation. Such brief interactions revealed to the captives that U.S. society wasn't entirely antagonistic toward them, even amid the fierce battles abroad. Perhaps the deepest cultural revelation came from the very essence of everyday routine. Observing households assembling for Sunday services, witnessing kids heading to classes without dread of air raids, or noting pairs browsing markets brimming with abundance. All this served as lessons learned through simple watching. It painted a picture of steadiness and affluence in a democratic nation engaged in conflict, yet not overwhelmed by it. For troops from Germany, shaped by decades of dictatorial control and indoctrination, these supervised peeks into U.S. existence provided a jarring alternative to their ingrained beliefs. Inevitably, the sight of German POWs strolling through U.S. communities sparked intense responses among ordinary folks. For numerous people, encountering troops in enemy attire, fresh from clashing with American forces overseas, proved disturbing. Still, even with the initial dismay, neighborhoods slowly adjusted. Gradually, their attitudes mirrored both the fears and the practicality of America during the war. Coverage in newspapers from that era frequently captured these conflicting sentiments. Columns in heartland regions voiced astonishment that adversaries could roam with minimal oversight. Certain locals debated if the approach was overly permissive, particularly as reports of losses among allies filled the headlines each day. However, authorities pointed out to everyone that the individuals lacked weapons, were vastly outnumbered, and faced the utter futility of fleeing over vast expanses of U.S. land. The military branch stressed that employing POW labor proved vital for the nation's economy, especially in farming, and assured nearby areas that protective measures worked well. Those who crossed paths with the prisoners firsthand typically showed interest rather than aggression. Ranchers laboring alongside German detainees described them as courteous and diligent overall. In personal recollections, a few mentioned sharing additional meals or beverages with them on pauses, acts that showed empathy alongside appreciation for their efforts. Inhabitants of villages who spotted them moving in clusters might murmur to one another but seldom escalated to verbal clashes. Rather, U.S. citizens usually watched in silence, their distrust softened by the awareness that these figures were already vanquished and secured. Certain instances did see tempers ignite, though. Households mourning boys fallen in places like North Africa or Europe struggled to detach their sorrow from viewing past foes on the sidewalks. A few neighborhoods voiced objections openly, sending notes to officials to call for tougher restrictions. Infrequently, people hurled abuse or shunned landowners hiring German workers. Such frictions underscored the tricky equilibrium officials needed to uphold, calming public worries about safety while relying on POWs to sustain key sectors. Notably, young people frequently helped span the gap. Stories describe kids greeting the detainees with waves, trying out basic German words, or trailing them simply from intrigue. Some ex-POWs later recalled how U.S. youths giggled and posed inquiries, moments that eased the oddity of imprisonment. For everyday people, seeing their offspring engage fearlessly bolstered the view that these individuals, despite prior peril, now represented no danger. Faith-based and community groups got drawn in too. Outfits like the YMCA or nearby congregations sometimes arranged gatherings featuring escorted German POWs, including performances or learning sessions. Though debated, such efforts embodied a core U.S. value of upholding humane standards amid hostilities. Accounts from spots like Alona, Iowa, describe holiday plays where POWs and locals took part together, creating striking images of ex-adversaries blending festive customs under watchful eyes. On the other hand, certain black neighborhoods spotted the oddity that German prisoners, handled with decent respect, at times enjoyed milder circumstances than African American residents enduring racial divides domestically. This contradiction didn't escape notice, and although not linked straight to these outings, it highlighted the intricate facets of U.S. society in the wartime era. In the end, responses from ordinary Americans varied widely, neither all rejection nor all embrace. They spanned from guarded tolerance to bitterness, influenced by individual backgrounds, combat sacrifices, and local demands varied. But one striking element endured: the astonishing reality that local populations accepted, and sometimes depended on, the free movement of adversarial troops along their roadways without restraints. This unusual situation etched deep marks on everyone involved. For the captured Germans, a vital link to their homeland arrived via the correspondence they could dispatch. Per Geneva Convention guidelines, each POW had permission to compose multiple missives monthly, although U.S. authorities scrutinized every phrase prior to forwarding them abroad. These preserved documents, housed in historical repositories and private heirlooms, offer invaluable direct accounts of strolling unbound across U.S. communities. They further illuminate how the detainees grappled with aligning their surroundings to the preconceived notions of America etched in their thoughts. Numerous narratives convey astonishment at the prosperity and structure they observed. A member of the Africa Corps penned to relatives in Bavaria during late 1943, noting that escorts accompany us outdoors, sans shackles. The locals observe us, yet offer no violence. Yet another dispatch referenced glimpsing stores brimming with beef, loaves, produce, and smokes, commodities that had all but disappeared from German urban centers amid Allied sieges and aerial assaults. The vision of abundantly supplied displays emerged as a persistent motif, with POWs employing careful language to highlight the vast gap from the deprivations in their native land. Detainees frequently juxtaposed their handling against the fates of prisoners in Europe. A number remembered how French and Soviet detainees in German facilities endured grueling toil amid harsh regimes. By comparison, the U.S. side not only compensated them modestly, but permitted escorted outings past the fences. In a 1944 note, one ex-trooper observed that our status resembles employees more than inmates. Censors greenlit such statements, presumably aware of their resonance upon reaching Germany. The epistles also uncovered intimate musings. Certain individuals confessed bewilderment, pondering if Nazi rhetoric had deceived them. A rural Bavarian taken in Tunisia remarked, "Propagandists depicted Americans as thugs and barbarians, but here, sentries converse with civility. Comprehension eludes me." An epistle archived within a Württemberg family trove detailed how detainees could join local worship gatherings under supervision, which the author deemed the pinnacle of humane conduct witnessed. Naturally, not every dispatch depicted an idyllic scene. A few voiced tedium, loneliness, or irritation over prolonged absences from kin. Others subtly conveyed bitterness, implying their efforts bolstered the foe's commerce. Nonetheless, the prevailing sentiment centered on amazement at the degree of faith extended during these ventures. The outright lack of bindings appeared to embody a deeper philosophical divide, emphasizing governance rooted in assurance over intimidation. Post-war, numerous survivors reflected that documenting these episodes aided in digesting them. While some exercised restraint, aware of oversight, others wove in understated cues that internment had altered their perspectives. Later gathered spoken recollections frequently cite those writings as the juncture when inmates privately, and to their loved ones, acknowledged that America defied the indoctrinated portrait. For families in Germany, absorbing these accounts surely provoked disorientation. They endured relentless air raids, allotments, and rigid oversight, even as their offspring described locales abundant in sustenance where overseers permitted detainees to roam publicly without bonds. Such disparities not only sustained spirits among the captives, but sowed uncertainty among recipients. Thus, the penned accounts proved as influential as the encounters themselves, bridging the ocean to convey a tale of detention far removed from expectations. As hostilities concluded in May 1945, the German detainees who had endured extended stays in America confronted the arduous shift to a devastated fatherland. By 1946, mass returns commenced, ferrying multitudes of ex-detainees from U.S. sites to the continent. However, they transported beyond recollections of restraint. the enduring image of a civilization permitting unbound passage through its settlements, toil on its fields, and observation of routines seemingly immune to the ravages afflicting their homeland. Upon arrival, many discoverers confronted a Germany utterly alien from the one departed. Urban centers like Hamburg, Cologne, and Dresden sprawled in devastation, with households grappling against deficits in provisions, shelter, and essentials. Set against this scene, tales from repatriated POWs of their American stints rang nearly mythical. Certain returnees recounted sauntering by emporiums laden with wares, of gaining permission to tune in exposure to American tunes, and glimpses of neighborhoods where families thrived amid the conflict left a profound mark on the prisoners. Back home, such tales struck fellow Germans as far-fetched, given the enormous divide separating their own struggles from the prosperity across the Atlantic. Reflections on reliability stayed at the heart of these recollections. Ex-captives highlighted the astonishing freedom of being led into villages unbound by irons. For individuals shaped by a system reliant on dread and force as everyday mechanisms of control, the notion of power wielded sans perpetual threats left an indelible mark. Numerous accounts after the war portrayed this as a pivotal shift in grasping democratic principles, a framework that enforced order not through binding adversaries, but by anticipating adherence to guidelines amid mutual regard. Scholars observe that such encounters yielded understated yet enduring impacts on Germany's society in the aftermath. A number of ex-PSWs evolved into educators, local influencers, or entrepreneurs who internalized the insights gained during confinement. They juxtaposed U.S. approaches to equity and efficiency against the dictatorial frameworks of their history. Testimonies gathered in the 1980s and 1990s reveal that countless individuals viewed their time in America as pivotal, molding their perspectives on democracy and even bolstering backing for West Germany's ties to the Western Alliance amid the Cold War. These encounters also colored how the men recalled their guards. Rather than dwelling on resentment, numerous voiced appreciation for adherence to the Geneva Convention. Narratives of village outings, labor assignments, and interactions with locals were passed down to offspring and descendants as illustrations of unforeseen compassion during worldwide strife. The lack of shackles in those remembrances emerged as an emblem of the broader disparities witnessed between rhetoric and truth, subjugation and faith, ruin and plenty. Nevertheless, the shift back held its intricacies. Certain ex-prisoners grappled with aligning their favorable U.S. encounters against the wreckage awaiting them domestically. For returnees to Soviet-controlled areas, circulating these narratives risked peril, since officials eyed warily those swayed by capitalist notions. Others discovered that kin and acquaintances, battered by air raids and grief, resisted tales of honorable handling by foes. Consequently, plenty buried their experiences for years, revealing them candidly only in old age. Even amid these hurdles, the imprint of imprisonment persisted vividly. The striking reality that Wehrmacht troops, erstwhile foes of America, had strolled unbound through U.S. settlements, formed a tale that spanned eras. It captured a wartime anomaly. Amid fierce combat, instances of decency arose that challenged assumptions and guided the path toward post-war healing.